Should I keynote?
Thank you. Hello and welcome to this presentation on XML and HTML cross-pollination. We're very much in the theme of let's mix things and see how it goes. But sometimes it might be possible to go a little bit too far in the direction of cross-pollinating things. So I believe you wanted to start?
Only for the next slide. So yes, there we are. One of the genesises of this talk was work that went on at the task force that the tag formed to look at how XML and HTML could be made to work better together to try and figure out what needed to change in the various communities to bring them together. And so a group of folks met for a while to look at that question, and the task force report has now been published as a note, and you're welcome to send in comments if you have any and see how well you think we addressed the use cases that we set out, or if we overlooked really useful use cases. So, and back to Robin.
So the idea behind the cross-pollination thing was it's not reflected in the report from the task force, but it's something that came to several people's minds as we were talking back and forth about the differences between HTML and XML. And I think it echoes what Eric said at the end of his talk, that XML is perhaps more of a philosophy than just a syntax, and a lot of that happens at a data model. And so the idea was that, yes, we do have this whole wonderful web of HTML-based things, but there might be some pretty good ideas from the XML world that could be imported. It might require changing syntax here, changing a few details there, but the idea was just like with a completely blank mind and no preconception to just dive into some good ideas that could exist on the XML side and try to import them. But in order to get there, first we have to look a little bit at how XML works today in the browser and to see what could be brought over.
Right, so cross-pollination is about going both ways, and one place to start is by looking at what works today in the browser. So there's an XML document, and if you stick that in the browser for some definition of the browser, some relatively modern browser, it actually more or less works. You get the XML is read by the browser, and the CSS is used to style it, and it produces something that looks reasonable. It wouldn't be too difficult for most vocabularies to write style sheets that would do a decent job for most of them, especially as CSS implementations move forward, and you can start to do things like generated text reliably and things like that. I think for vocabularies that require more significant restructuring for presentation, you might run into some challenges, but it mostly works today. The image tags are a little tricky at the moment. I couldn't find a browser that implemented the relevant CSS bits, but maybe I wasn't running the most bleeding edge. But the CSS languages are being developed to support mechanisms that would allow you to extract the URLs from the attribute values, for example, in the vocabulary and display them. So you'd get pretty well. So you can put the XML in the browser and you can style it. You might then like to be able to do some interactivity with it. And remarkably or otherwise, if you stick in a script element in the XHTML namespace, that sort of mostly works as well. At least the script does get run. The scripts are interpreted. They have access to the XML DOM, which is not quite the same as the HTML DOM. So I'm sure there are various gotchas along the way. One of the things that might be nice if you were going to try and pursue this more aggressively is something like the XML style sheet PI for pointing to the script. Having to add the XHTML elements to your documents to get the scripts in is perhaps not the best thing in the world, although perhaps it's also not the worst. We have the flexibility to embed different namespaces in our XML vocabularies. So now you can do styling and you can do scripting, so you're sort of most of the way there, except for this linking thing. I'm sure this linking thing was important to the web. I remember that from a talk earlier. If the links were easy to recognize in the XML, if you had a vocabulary for expressing link semantics, for example, you'd be reasonably far along. But Xlink support hasn't been widely adopted, and since I signed on to update that spec, foolishly perhaps, I have to say that I'm somewhat disappointed by its failure to be widely deployed, but there you go. You can emulate it. You can use scripting and styling to fake it, and there are some examples I think that Robin wrote in the paper that show how you can find the links using scripts and then style them and make the behaviors do what you want. So it would be nice to have some declarative way of doing links. Maybe Xlink was the wrong approach, but you could use the A element. You could, fair enough, you could use the A element. Yeah, okay, you could use the A element. The next thing to think about is accessibility, and I think here we can say somewhat confidently that it is theoretically possible to get good accessibility out of XML documents. In fact, maybe it's theoretically possible to get better accessibility out of XML documents, since the element names can have more refined semantics. But in practice, you get almost no accessibility at all, because the screen readers and the tools that are designed to do accessibility take advantage of the fact that they know what H1s are and what paragraphs are and lists are, and they can use that information. And in an XML vocabulary, there's just none of that. If XML had taken off on the web in the ways that some of us imagined it was going to, we might now have indirect mechanisms for doing that. You could easily imagine a vocabulary that would allow you to specify the semantics in a way that would be useful, but no. XML in the browser, it's just hard to justify. The browser vendors aren't interested in it because the average developer on the street is not terribly interested in it. I think the best way forward, perhaps, is to look at technologies that are going to try and treat XML in a first-class way, as the Saxonica folks are doing with Sax and CE, which I think shows a way forward. And back to Robin.
Okay, and so in keeping with this theme of things that sort of mix both worlds, some of you might remember XPointer. It never really took off, but it's this great idea that you could have your URLs that would actually point to things inside the documents in a manner that's slightly more powerful than just using regular fragments. And so the XPointer syntax is fairly straightforward. And it so happens that we have this other piece of technology that's pretty good at finding things in documents. It's called CSS Selectors, or Selectors for short for some people. And if you mix the two together, you actually get some fairly useful results. So for instance, you could use the CSS XPointer scheme and find so the first one finds all the elements with class RFC 2119, that's conformance classes in the specification. But you could also find the titles in the section. And of course, you could point to the third paragraph in an article, even though it doesn't have an ID. And so Simon St. Laurent and Eric Mayer actually made an implementation of this that runs in several browsers. And it's something that's actually useful, that reuses a piece of the XML toolkit in conjunction with CSS. And of the few crazy things that we listed in this talk, I think this might actually be the most useful and the most, and it could be something that's worth pushing forward. Another approach to this cross-pollination thing is to think about FO. FO was never supported in the browser, but there was a project last year called PDF.js that essentially implements PDF in the browser. And if you have PDF, you reckon it ought to be possible to do FO as well. If nothing else, it'll be easier to parse in the first place. So I think it would be an interesting question to figure out what's missing in the toolkit in order to be able to implement FO using a JavaScript library directly in the browser. There's probably a lot that can be taken from PDF.js to do the same thing. And it would be a lot nicer to generate FO than PDF for all the people who have to do this sort of stuff. So that's one avenue to explore. Norm, I'll let you talk about compilation to JS.
Oh, well, yeah, so I sort of stole a bit of this slide and moved it earlier, didn't I? One of the interesting things we're seeing is some moves to take existing XML technologies and rebuild them using GWT now, and you can imagine using other toolkits to run them in JavaScript. So Saxon Client Edition, which I mentioned earlier, does that. And last year or the year before, Wojciech Toman, who's out there somewhere, gave a presentation, sorry, not here, at Balasage, I think, showing how his XProc pipeline implementation had been implemented to run in the browser by compiling it down to GWT. So I think, JavaScript has become a powerful enough language to be used to implement some fairly complex things, and including perhaps some technologies that we're familiar with in other spaces.
And to take an example of one language that actually jumped the barrier, a few years ago, the idea that SVG could use the HTML syntax in order to work made people scream. Everyone thought that it would destroy users' content, it would confuse developers, and essentially it would kill SVG. But after a long and difficult discussion, people agreed that it would be possible to use SVG directly in HTML with an HTML syntax overall. It's a complicated topic, but overall it works. And so I think now we can look back on what happened and figure out if it went well. We now have SVG supported in every major browser that runs there, and it works in HTML. We now have much, much larger adoption than we ever did. A lot of people don't realize that they're using SVG because they're doing it indirectly through a JavaScript library such as Raphael, but it actually is being used. And the results in terms of adoption and mindshare from SVG jumping over and being absorbed into HTML this way are such that the working group has completely changed its mind from opposition to the idea several years ago to now wanting to integrate more into the HTML stack. And the first thing that's going to happen for SVG 2.0 is, for instance, that Xlink is going to be dropped from SVG, and it'll just use href like everyone else. And another thing that's being discussed, I don't think it's been resolved quite yet, is actually dropping the SVG namespace on the floor and putting everything in the HTML namespace and declaring that it really doesn't matter. So this is a fairly strong decision for a working group that has, traditionally been extremely pro-XML and firmly against HTML. And culturally, things have moved a lot. And the result of opening up and deciding that syntax didn't matter that much have been extremely positive. So this is something that I think it's an experience that other people might want to consider when thinking about the topic. Now, to go into an area that's slightly more contentious, I think we should also look at how distributed extensibility works in both planets. There was a huge distributed extensibility debate about HTML, and a lot of people who came from an XML background said, XML does distributed extensibility is great, it's wonderful, and it's a real shame that HTML doesn't do it. You're wrong, that's bad, blah, blah, blah. It turns out, if you look at the facts, the only thing that XML has for DE is namespaces. But it's all nice to have syntax for something, but you need it to be supported throughout the processing toolchain for it to be meaningful. And if you look at the majority of the XML toolchain, it's actually anti-distributed extensibility. Most dominant validation languages do not by default accept namespaces for other languages, foreign namespaces that they were not defined for. If you start decorating a tree in a distributed extensibility manner, then it will stop validating with most XML schema, most relaxing that are written out there, unless they were specifically crafted to support it. Same thing, most processing pipelines will at one point or another fall to pieces if you start adding arbitrary namespaces and decorating your tree, because the tools we have are actually not designed to support that unless you pay careful attention to do it. And also because we never came to agreement on the right way, at least on a common way, of ignoring extended namespaces that are added to your own language. And so, because of that, in practice, unless you're one of the 3 NVDL users out there, and hey, I'm one of them, XML does not have proper distributed extensibility in the ecosystem. Whereas if you look on the HTML side, maybe this syntax is not as extensible as some people would like it to be, but you have things like web intents that allow you essentially to extend the browser with new functionality, new APIs, new services that you can create completely from the outside without touching anything, without installation. And you have things like web components that allow you to define your own vocabulary that maybe instead of element names, we'll use class names or data star or etc. Or perhaps even a new namespace if you really want to, and can actually allow you to implement that in a browser. And there are very good rules that are shared across the board for ignoring things that are not understood. And this is very important. So I think that HTML actually got distributed extensibility right where XML didn't, and that's in large part thanks to the community. I think we're starting to run slightly late, so I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit. I really love XSLT. I used to use it a lot, but it doesn't necessarily work all that well if you come from a JavaScript background. It's hard to pick up. The people don't like the syntax, etc. And JavaScript is pretty good at document transformation. People do it a lot in interactive fashion. So I wondered, could we get these two in a room and figure something out? And I haven't, unfortunately, had time to implement it. I'll see if I can implement it this afternoon. But I came up with essentially a way of doing something XSLT-like that's entirely in JavaScript using some APIs. The example is fairly straightforward. Essentially, you take an HTML document, and every time you see a section element, the section up there is a CSS selector. You transform it so that it becomes a div with class section. That's a very simple transformation. There's a more complex one in the paper that demonstrates more of the features. But the idea is that we took XSLT's rather pure and very interesting processing model, and we sort of wrapped it up in JavaScript to see if it would work. And I think it works, actually. I don't know if anyone will actually want to use anything like that, but I like the idea, and it might inspire something. The other thing that is not very powerful in the current web ecosystem is validation. I mean, there are good tools that will validate HTML, but a lot of the HTML content that's out there uses rules that are beyond just HTML validity, and actually people often don't care that much about HTML validity, but they do care about the fact that the first element inside the body must be a div with a given class, or that you must have an H1 somewhere, or other things like that. They want to enforce their own business rules. And of course, we always need more schema languages. That's something that the XML community taught us. So in order to mix HTML and schema languages, we came up with this idea, which just the name of it is simply wonderful. CSS schema. You know this has to be right? And the syntax of it, again, haven't had time to implement it, but I actually started, and it shouldn't be that hard, is that for people who are familiar with schematron, this should look quite obvious. Basically, you create context, so inside the head, if you don't have a title, then you complain that it doesn't have a title. Inside the body, that's rule body. So scope is a special CSS selector that applies to the scope. This is the current scope, so it's body in this case. If it doesn't have a direct child with standard top class, blah, 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 it's missing the top component. And you can write all sorts of rules like this that will layer on top of your HTML and that will validate your business rules using this CSS extension. And you could even probably take it further, and in addition to the assertions, you could add styling so that you could visually represent validation errors directly in the browser as people are viewing the page. So we move on to the conclusions. I think maybe you should start.
Sure. I think what What it says in the paper, I'll basically repeat what it says in the paper. I think if you look at XML and HTML from far enough away, they're about representing trees and doing things with trees. And so from far enough away, there's sort of not much difference between them at all. And yet, by the time you zoom in to the technical details about where the angle brackets go, there's sort of almost no common ground. There's a huge amount of friction between the communities. And I think it would be nice if we could find some common ground, some place to do what Robin said, sort of ignore the syntax and figure out better ways to get along. So.
And so as a more normative conclusion, we can also say...
you added some slides too, I see.
Hey, if you didn't read my slides... yeah, I think we can forget about XML on the web, but we can definitely think about XML's good ideas on the web and try to bring them in and push them further. After this, are there any questions? Okay, sorry. Yeah, okay, so we'll leave questions for the panel, actually, which is after Anna's talk.